Thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful attendance as usual, and you won't be disappointed. Last year, a great friend of mine who I walk with and swap books with introduced me to A Touch of India, and I wasn't disappointed. It's a country that I've long had fascination with, but haven't been to, not least in part because when I went to my husband, he says, not India. But it's wonderful. As in Valerie's words, it's a complex, interesting country full of irregularities. Valerie Britton-Wilson has an MA in political sociology and PhD in social psychology, both from Melbourne University. She also specialises in in-depth interviews and focus groups, and which leads to a fascination with meeting many people. She's used the background of her love of travel, textiles, history, and her parents' unusual love story in this wonderful book with India at its centre. It's my great pleasure to introduce Valerie and welcome her husband John to speak to you.
So thank you very much, Mary Lou, and for all your organising, and thank you to the Queenscliffe Historical Museum for inviting me to speak. And I also would like to thank David Bain for the wonderful video he produced. In fact, it's rather a hard act to follow, and you might well be disappointed. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I'm not a historian. I'm a social researcher, as Mary Lou said, and a try-hard rag trader. The book's title, A Touch of India, lays the ground. No one can claim to know any country, even one's own, but far less one like India, with its 1.4 billion people, adding over 13 million in the past year alone. India's youthful, the median age is only 27. 500,000 emigrate each year, and Indians are the largest migrant group in Victoria. In India, there are 122 major languages, 22 official languages, and thousands of dialects. It's a big country geographically with lots of different climatic regions, and like us, it's a federation. But it consists of 28 states and 8 territories, and with a central national government. Each of those states has a unique history and culture and a different language. And it's also India's a republic within the Commonwealth. Coincidentally, Indian Independence Day happens to be the same day as our Australia Day. My hope when I wrote the book was that I could give people some insights into India, a few dollops of history, some knowledge of textiles, of the charms and challenges of doing business in India, and importantly, of lives, especially in middle-class India, which is a huge segment and growing, but it's a bit neglected. Most of the books, whether fiction or non-fiction about India, tend to focus on the extremes. They're either about extreme poverty or extreme riches, but not so often about the vast middle. But overall, I think I just wanted to spark interest in India and get people to follow up of their own accord. I actually began writing about the Indian experience as a way of getting to sleep at night. Nearly 25 years ago, a friend, Sue McFall, and I started a business that involved regular trips to India, sometimes twice a year. The days were so full and so stimulating, but exhausting, and I found lying on the bed at night and writing emails back to friends and family was a way of trying to make sense of it all and help sort of settle the mind a bit. But at that stage, I had no book in mind, though I did have a history with India that I'll come back to. My friend and I were anyway on a sharp learning curve. With no experience whatsoever, we'd plunged into the rag trade and started a little international business. It involved designing a range of clothing for which we commissioned over 2 decades, thousands of metres of hand-woven fabrics. We had to learn about pattern making, samples, shipping issues, customs duties, foreign exchange rates, and hardest of all, marketing and selling. But I'd like to start today with two stories. In India, we had a regular driver, as most visitors and business people do. His name was Darshan. Each year, every day for almost 3 weeks, we sat in his battered taxi in Delhi traffic jams. He only had a smattering of English, but we gradually built a picture of his life, and it's a common story. He left home in a village in the Punjab, left home at age 13 with only $2 to his name. Gradually making his way, saving enough to buy an old car, becoming a driver, attached to, on call to a big city hotel, which is how we met him. We'd come to the hotel portico, where we asked the obsequious concierge, with his abundant turban and abundant mustachios, to call car number 5351. And he would bellow the number through a megaphone, and Darshan's ambassador taxi, yellow and black, like a large beetle, would appear. The car had broken springs and lots of dents, but bright white antimacassars covered the seats. Darshan always looked immaculate, with a fresh turban and fresh shirt each day, but at that stage he was living in his car. How he managed to look so spruce remained a mystery. After a few years, he progressed to a timeshare bed. 3 people in a tiny rented room with a narrow single mattress, 8 hours each, depending on their work shifts. Then, a year or 2 later, he'd moved into a 1-room flat and, with a new wife, arranged by their parents. All this time, he'd go back by train to the Punjab for just 2 weeks every year. Then there were 2 children, then a 2-room flat. We took gifts each year for his wife and children, but a few years later, we discovered that they weren't actually his. They were his brothers. But he didn't want to tell us because he didn't want to tell us he didn't have his own, because there's some shame in India attached to not having children. Then one day he joyfully told us his brother and wife were having a child, especially for him and his wife, to call their own and to bring up entirely as their own. Darshan looked after us for our first decade in India and in all sorts of situations. He'd appear with an umbrella if he noticed any drops of rain. He'd keep an eye on us in what he thought were dangerous situations. For example, there was a market we went to look for some interesting buttons, and he said it was very unsafe and that very few Indian women would ever go there, much less 2 middle-aged white women. He hovered anxiously until we were safely back in his car. Our clothing maker lives and works from a place called Sainik Farms, south of Delhi. The drive there each day from our central Delhi hotel took at least an hour. While we were there, usually all day, Darshan would park in a vacant green lot nearby and catch up on sleep. He would say, "This is my hotel, room 5351. And his story is now chapter 22 in the book, and no prizes for guessing what we brought for his next presents, some nice woolen Aussie socks. And Delhi does get terribly cold in winter, which people are often surprised to hear. Now, the story of our next driver took us into more dramatic territory. Naresh was in his mid-20s when we first met him. A good-looking, well-spoken, charming young man with good English, and all self-taught because he left school at 15. He'd picked us up from the airport to take us to our new abode, which was a guest house in South Delhi, closer to where we worked. The next day, his father came to be our driver for the day. We asked if he was looking for a wife for his impressive son. He surprised us. He was an uneducated man, but we knew he was a devout and very traditional Hindu. He said very firmly, "I don't believe in arranged marriage." Now, that's not surprising these days, in fact, coming from more middle-class circles or better educated or better off people. But, you know, they accept that a love match, as it's called, is perfectly acceptable. But for people like this man's father, arranged marriages are absolutely the thing to do. So we were surprised and we asked him why he didn't believe in them. And then to our dismay, we could see in the rear vision mirror tears welling up in his eyes. He told us the story. He'd arranged a good marriage for his second daughter. In fact, they sold their home to raise money for the dowry. And here's his daughter on her wedding day. A month later, she was dead, murdered by her husband. And tragically, this isn't uncommon. The widowed man can marry again and get another dowry. I asked if they'd go to the police, and he said, "No, madam, we can't afford the police. The other family can, they've paid them off." So another daughter that they'd also arranged a marriage for was ill-treated violently by her husband because she'd only had 2 daughters and there was no son. So the parents had to take her back. And so she now lives at home along with her 2 daughters, and the father has 3 more mouths to feed. So no wonder he was against arranged marriages. But over the next decade, we listened to an unfolding story of his handsome son meeting a Muslim girl. His father said, "I'll suicide if he marries her." What a dreadful threat, the poor boy. The boy thought his father would, in fact, eventually come round, and they did marry, but in a civil service with no parents attending. And that would have been humiliating for both lots of parents, a disgrace on the families. But as is the custom, the poor girl had to move in with her in-laws, knowing how they felt about her. And as a Muslim, to them, as strict vegetarians, she was simply sullied by meat eating, even though she'd given up eating meat. They kept their distance. She couldn't eat out of the same vessels, even though she'd renounced meat. And we were puzzled about another thing. Given how modern the couple had been by marrying anyway, rebelling against parents and all the usual marriage rituals, why had she given up her job in a call centre to just be a stay-at-home wife, especially when the atmosphere there was so fraught? But we came to understand that for her husband, it was a sign of pride that he should support his wife, not have her go to work, a sign of being more middle class. These things made us realise that it's all very well to spout tolerance from afar. In fact, we can now understand why it's preferred and so much easier to marry within one's own religion and within one's own caste. The realities of fundamentally differing day-to-day practices, and as well as the beliefs, can so complicate the blending that we all, in theory, think is such a good idea. The couple have separated, the family is divided, the son no longer lives at home, and to us that seems pretty normal. He's in his mid-30s now, but it's a very big step in their context, and it's shaming for the poor father again. So, as you can gather, all of this is what we're picking up as we're driving around in cars trying to be business people. But a few years ago, Naresh, the driver, was hefting our suitcases into the boot of his car, and we noticed a very large carton of sanitary pads. It turned out that during the intervening year, he'd been the driver for a leading hospital foundation. Corporations in India over a certain size are obliged to set aside, I think it's 2% of their profits for charitable works. And he'd joined forces with a young woman, a social worker, to start a charity aimed to spread better practices in menstrual health. I could tell you a lot more about the statistics here, but that would be a very long story. But the main thing to say is that, as in many countries, still menstruation is a taboo topic, and women in India are often cast out of the house during their period, not allowed into temples, and treated generally as pariahs. The shame and the silence combined with poverty, leads to some awfully unsanitary practices in which girls get terrible infections, sometimes causing infertility. Anyway, over the next years, I joined them as they visited schools and orphanages where she spoke and he happily waited outside to distribute sanitary pads, all quite matter of fact. There he is with a group of schoolgirls, all looking so pristine in pink. And then the project extended to educating boys as well about their own and about women's sexual health, educating girls about sexual assault, which is apparently rife within slum households, as well as, in a more upbeat way, giving them computer lessons and the opportunity to have music lessons, all sorts of things that little teenage girls living in slums would never get. And now they've established small premises in the very same slum where this young man grew up. The Hospital Foundation provides immunisation, even the Gardasil vaccine. And when COVID came, they distributed food parcels and sanitary needs with the terrific slogan, "Periods don't pause for pandemics." So this is a young man who left school at 15. He's giving up income that he could otherwise earn. He's ambitious, he's very personable, and one would think he could make a much more conventionally successful life, and an easier one. But he's giving up all this, though still acting as a driver at night to earn some money, in order to run a menstrual health charity. It's just extraordinary. If there's time at the end, I'll give you an update on this. But you can see why every day in India is so incredibly interesting. And as I said, all that while we were navigating the sort of daily juggernaut of our roles as businesswomen, learning a new trade ourselves and trying to appear as if we knew what we were doing. One hotel we stayed in Hyderabad had brass plaques at the entrance and in every lift, which proclaimed that it was a hotel for the profound businessman. So we were trying. But the stories of these two drivers are the sort of micro-histories that, as a human being, but also as a professional social researcher, fascinated me, as it does many visitors to India. But now I'd like to focus on the much bigger picture. So, in the beginning, there were two nations. One was a vast, mighty, and magnificent empire, brilliantly organised and culturally unified, which dominated a massive swathe of the earth. The other was an undeveloped, semi-feudal realm, riven by religious factionalism and barely able to feed its illiterate, diseased, and stinking masses. The first was India, the second was England. This is, of course, it's praised for dramatic effect, but it does remind us of India's incredible past, dating back many millennia. There's evidence of Neolithic Stone Age shelters, including rock art. Then there were the great Indus Valley civilizations of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with urban planning, drainage systems, wheeled transport, and decorative objects. And we're talking BC 4000 to 1000. The earliest documents, a vast collection of sacred poetry called the Rig Vedas, they date from 1200 BC. In 700 BC, there's a Sanskrit text on medicine and surgery. In 600 BC came the sacred Hindu text, the Upanishads. There were written grammars, treatises on astronomy and astrology, mathematics, including the role of zero, and equations, and square roots. When people wondered why India was so adept in the leap to computer sciences and IT, it's because they had this long and distinguished history and affinity with mathematics and arithmetic. In the 500s BC, the great religions of Jainism and Buddhism emerged in India. And over the next centuries, there were various waves of rulers. You've probably heard of Ashoka the Great. He was the standout emperor in the 300s BC, who ruled a huge swathe of land, most of northern India, Afghanistan, and more. And he embraced all religions, but especially promoted Buddhism, and he expressly committed himself to the welfare of his subjects. And the Gupta Empire was the next major one, and it's described sometimes as the Indian equivalent of the European Renaissance. Beautiful sculpture and exquisite temples emerged in this period. And again, there was great tolerance of other religions. Then followed centuries of invasions and successive rulers, too many to detail here. The next major empire was the Mughals. They came originally from Persia, now Iran, and ruled India for almost 300 years, from about 1526. Many of you will have read William Dalrymple's works, so I won't even try to go there. But I think it's really important to acknowledge this extraordinary history, because when we look at a country that's often defined by poverty and was for a while brought to its knees by COVID, it's good to be reminded of India's great past, and no doubt a great future. In fact, it's sort of interesting at the moment to see India on the rise, and at the same time Britain is rather on the decline. Here's how there's a polemicist, Sashi Tharoor, some of you will have read his books. He sums it up in one of his novels. If people would only read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, study the golden ages of the Mauryas and the Guptas, and even of those Muslim chaps, the Mughals, they would realize that India is not an underdeveloped country, but a highly developed one in an advanced state of decay. Now, it was in the later 16th century that England began its impressive journey to a worldwide empire. Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh set off on great voyages to claim booty and distant lands for England. A new British trading company arrived on the scene in about 1600, the East India Company. It grabbed exclusive trading rights and over the next 200 years, it effectively ruled most of India. It established its own enormous army, which was in fact bigger than the British Army, as well as its own currency. And it controlled 25% of the world's trade. We're talking textiles, indigo, spices, tea, precious metals and jewels, and of course opium. Now, to inject my own family history into this backdrop, in 1757, which was the year of the Battle of Plassey, when Clive of India stepped up to his pedestal and later onto tins of curry powder, an ancestor of mine became a director of the East India Company. His name was Sir James Creed, and he was the Member of Parliament for Canterbury and a Fellow of the Royal Society. I used to feel a bit boastful about this ancestry, but Dalrymple's book opened my eyes to the company's dastardly deeds. He describes it as the world's first ruthless corporate raider, and many of its directors ruthlessly set about enriching themselves. On top of that, I discovered that this illustrious ancestor made his fortune by processing something called white lead. This was an important ingredient in artists' paints. Flakes of white lead were soaked in vinegar and made the colour painters still know as flake white. Also, even worse, pale skin being a sign of refinement, people used mixtures of white lead to make their faces look paler, and it was later found to be carcinogenic and even lethal. However, Sir James Creed died only 5 years after his appointment, and I did wonder whether it was lead poisoning. But he didn't live to experience many of the spoils of his East India Company directorship, if any. But successive generations of the Creed family, and this is my mother's family, continued to serve in East India Company armies and in the British Indian armies in India and Afghanistan. So this is Sir James Creed's great-great-grandson and my great-great-grandfather, Colonel Henry Creed. And here is his French wife. What a marvellous name. Aurelia Cecilia de Boubel de Montpinçon. She is super aristocratic. The double de indicates blue blood from all sides. Anyway, Henry and Aurelia met and married in England. Her family had escaped there before, in anticipation of the French Revolution. And Henry and Aurelia had their first 3 children in England, and then they set off to produce tea in India, where they also produced 7 more children. The family history has been researched and compiled by the French side of the family. Now, I don't expect that you can read this, but I'm just going to point out some key points. So up here is Sir James Creed, the director of the East India Company and the MP. And coming down this side, and then working our way along here to this fella. And then this is where Henry and Aurelia marry, and they have these 10 children along this line here. So that's the important line. And the thing I want to point out to you is that each one of their children who married, they've inserted the spouse's name. But for this fellow, James Louis, there was no wife put in. And why? It's because he married a local Indian girl, and an orphan at that. Quelle horreur, the French relatives probably said. He's married a native. And they certainly weren't going to put her on the family tree. The story is that she was an orphan taken in by the tea planting family who lived next door to the Creeds. She was rescued from the side of the road after a severe storm killed her parents. So she grew up with this next door English family. Their surname was Money, and they gave her an English name, wait for it, Mabel. So Mabel Money. What a doer name when you think of lovely Indian names like Anushka or Shakuntala, and even compared with the mellifluous name of her mother-in-law, Aurelia Cecilia. So poor old Mabel. Mabel and Louis had 4 children who were then, of course, officially Anglo-Indian. One was our grandfather, Edward St. Clair Creed, so he's there. And I have to say, Mabel wasn't the sort of lissom beauty that I'd imagined she was going to be, and I was a bit disappointed to see she looks perfectly nice, but a little bit dour and plain. Anglo-Indians modelled their lives as close to the British as they could. They wore British dress. My grandfather habitually wore 3-piece suits and spats, even though he was half Indian. They attended Protestant churches and schools. My mother went to the famous Cathedral School in Bombay and then to St. Mary's, Pune, where she became head girl. It was a high Anglican school. They were taught by nuns in Wimples, and their exams were set and marked in Cambridge. Many of you will have read about the British fishing fleets, shiploads of British single women sent to India to try to land a suitable match. But at various times during British rule, British men in India were in fact encouraged to intermarry with local women. It was a bit of social engineering or a bit of genetic engineering. The Brits thought that this would produce a kind of buffer social stratum in between the relatively few English people ran the empire in India, running a country with a vast, potentially ungovernable mass. So they thought that Anglo-Indians would be a good buffer. And the other practical thing was that being born in India, of Indian stock, they had better immunity to diseases. They were culturally adapted already. They didn't require breaking in the way that someone coming from England did. And it was said that in the 18th century, as many as 1 in 3 British men had Indian wives or mistresses. And interestingly, they've gathered that information from analysis of wills. But especially in the later part of British rule, fraternising was definitely not encouraged. There were even anti-miscegenation laws passed after the 1857 rebellion. Intermarriage brought disgrace upon families, and this was, I think, the case for my great-grandfather. And either way, Anglo-Inns were never fully accepted by the British, and they were never allowed to rise above the middle ranks of any organisation, no matter how talented they were. The disparaging term the British used for a woman of mixed blood, like my mother, was a Chutney Mary. So this is the first element in the book's title. We stayed in India twice as children for several months, but then there was a gap of over 4 decades till I went again. On my first trip there as an adult, I noticed that when I said I had some Indian blood, there was no reaction, a silence or an awkwardness that I found puzzling. Usually they're such polite people, and the Indian friends I met never asked, where did this come from? Why have you got some Indian blood? So it did lead me to investigate attitudes in a very, not in a formal way, but over the next almost 30 years of trips to India, I kept my antennae tuned for what could possibly be going on, and I've woven some of that through the book. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit to my mother, Pearl Creed, who was born in Bombay in 1921. India at the time was very much in flux. It was the last decades of the British Raj. Indians were pressing for greater independence. The British and for self-rule. 1919 had seen the absolutely infamous Amritsar massacre. British Governor General Dyer ordered troops to fire on hundreds of picnicking Indians in a walled garden. There was no escape except a well into which many hundreds plunged, dying while trying to escape the gunfire. This garden's not far from the beautiful Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar, and I've been to the garden. It's pretty hard to stomach the descriptions of the event and the thousands of gunshot scars on the walls. I hoped the many Indian visitors at the time weren't blaming me for the sins of my ancestors, and the massacres is cited as one of the critical incidents or the critical turning points in the history of the struggle for Indian independence. When Pearl finished school in 1938, she studied art at a famous art school in Bombay. It's known as the Sir J.J. School of Applied Art, and it's still going strong. And interestingly, Rudyard Kipling's father was one of the first principals of it. It's not a very good photo, but you can see why it's called the Sir J.J. School of Art. It's a fabulous name, but awfully hard to say. He was one of the great Parsi philanthropists in India, but specifically in Bombay. From school, she got an unpaid job in a dashing new world of advertising, and we're talking early 1940s. Which she describes very amusingly. It is a chapter in the book. And then she landed her own weekly column, in fact, sometimes a page or more, in the Illustrated Weekly Times of India. The Times of India is, in fact, one of the largest circulation papers in the world. So it was no mean feat for a young woman, especially in those times, anywhere in the world, much less India, and aged only 20, to land a job like this. So this was one of her advertisements when she was an apprentice, very typical of the time. And these are the front covers of Illustrated Weekly of India at the back. She also wrote film reviews for Film India magazine, And you can see why her parents didn't approve, and she wrote under a pseudonym for that one. Then the war came. In the war years, the domestic Quit India turmoil settled a bit because 2.5 million Indians joined the war effort for the British. But the war changed Pearl's life. Remember, Anglo-Indians on the whole were very pro-British, and the war was right on the doorstep when the Japanese invaded Burma. So women rallied to help. There were thousands of soldiers on leave in Bombay, and my mother volunteered in a canteen for American soldiers. And I found a note on a torn scrap of paper from, that was one of Mum's columns and pages. So she was fond of illustrating, as you can see, and writing. And there she is. At about that time, it's one of those strange tinted photos. And there, this note: "My dear young lady, would you object if I sat in my lonely seat and just keep on gazing into your beautiful eyes? Never have I seen such a beautiful girl." It's torn off at that point, so I don't know. She then got an official position at the British Censor Office. She was on the books and magazines desk, and they were tasked with preventing anything that might help the Japanese directly or indirectly. So she was reading and censoring material written by Indian nationalists wanting the British out. It's interesting, I can sense in her letters and writing a growing affinity with her Indianness, a sympathy with the Indian desire to be independent, which in her thoroughly Anglo upbringing was new to her. But she got caught up in several rather frightening anti-British protests, which she described, and I've included in the book. But my mother and her family always saw the amusing side of things. They all shared a droll sense of humour, and my mother, who painted as well as drew and wrote, had an especially observant eye. So her ability to paint pictures in words was superb, and always with insight and humour. One of the stories she related was that the Censor Office employees had to sign an Official Secrets Act, and they were expressly forbidden to tell what they did and where they worked. At first, they operated from a nondescript building with no signage, and no one took any notice of them. Then, for some unknown reason, it was decided that they should wear khaki uniforms, complete with epaulet badges, which said, "We work in silence," but written in Greek. She was standing at the bus stop on her way to work one day when an American serviceman asked her what the badge meant. "I'm not allowed to say," she replied primly. "Well, don't then," he said. "I can see it says South Epsom salts." And you can sort of see what he meant. At a dinner party in 1943, Pearl was seated next to a rather handsome young Englishman. This was our father-to-be, Donald Britton. He'd gone up to Cambridge in 1938 to take up a scholarship at Emmanuel College to study music and modern languages. He was already an accomplished pianist, a concert pianist, and had had his own compositions published and performed while he was still in his teens. At Cambridge, his talents flourished. He performed widely, conducted not only college choirs, but the official Cambridge University choir, all aged only 19. But after only 1 year of blissful university life, in 1939, war is declared, and next thing you know, he's in the jungle in Burma. I've exaggerated a bit. There was a year or so of training before he became part of the famous Chindit brigades. They were commando regiments, really, and it was an experiment by the British in guerrilla warfare. They were airlifted in behind the Japanese lines into Burma to try to stop the Japanese getting into India. The conditions were appalling. Mountainous jungle terrain, monsoons, mud, malaria, leeches, dysentery. How this tall, thin, sensitive, introverted musician made the transition is really hard to conceive. But it seems that he was one of those tough, wiry types who was more resilient than many of the others. And one of the books I read about it said that he was the only one in his group still eating when all the others were struck down with dysentery. And apart from the obvious horror of it all, he loved the warmth, he loved the people, he loved his leave breaks in hill stations. And it was on one such leave that he met my mother at that dinner party in Bombay. In the old suitcase in our house that housed our family photos, I found a manila envelope labelled in big black texter, private. Dad's courtship letters to Mum. So I hesitated. I actually hesitated for 2 years. You can imagine how inhibiting that word private is. And we were also a very private family. We weren't the sort of family who shared emotional conversation much at all. So I eventually plucked up courage. I was about halfway through writing the book. When I did pluck up courage, I discovered that Pearl and Donald had obviously just been immediately smitten that night. And after months of courtship, which I could read 2 to 3 years worth, a courtship that was fraught with all sorts of obstacles, not least getting letters out from wherever he was in the jungle through Dehradun and other places and somehow get them to Bombay. But they eventually became engaged and somehow a ring was delivered. There's the ring. Needless to say, it's not my hand. It's my daughter's. But part of the book's title is an unlikely romance. Actually, I should have said an inconvenient romance because my mother was already engaged to someone else. So by piecing together hints in her writings and comments in the letters, I found that he was a fellow Anglo-Indian with whom she'd worked in that advertising agency she had an apprenticeship in. He was 10 years older than her, and when the war came, he'd joined up. Perhaps it was this that led them to announce an engagement when she was only 19. It wasn't uncommon, I think, with war and separation looming for people to leap into commitments. So he went off to war and hadn't been heard of since, for 2 years. Regular letters from Pearl went unanswered. His parents tried to trace him through the Red Cross. Nothing. So had he been killed? Had he been taken prisoner? Or from Pearl's perspective, had he just changed his mind? Perhaps he didn't want her anymore. Remember how young she was. It was a hard situation for a young thing who, because she was engaged, it was considered unseemly to attend all the dances and films that all her single friends were going to, and Bombay was quite swinging in the war years. So by social convention, an engaged woman who was already accounted for, as they say, was only allowed to attend dinner parties given by married couples, which is where she met my father. Her parents would have disapproved enormously. To cast off someone who was missing at war was not acceptable behaviour, and I can imagine a lot of tut-tutting. And there was also the very difficult task of informing her former fiancé's parents. The letters reveal endless obstacles and difficulties over nearly 3 years on the way to an eventual marriage, just weeks after the war ended. And to tantalise you, the story of what happened to her previous fiancé is in the book, but it includes one of the most heart-wrenching letters you'll ever read. So there's the wedding, and there's one with his at the Taj Hotel where they had their reception, and her father in his usual three-piece suit. 6 months later, they returned to Cambridge for my father to resume his studies. So remember, he'd spent years without a piano. But getting back to Cambridge, they had to readjust to post-war life. He was a student again, and he had a new wife. It must have been difficult for both of them. Mother had left behind her warm and loving family, and they would have, in a sense, preferred the previous fiancé because he was also Anglo-Indian. He lived in India, whereas marrying an Englishman, they knew they'd lose their daughter. So she'd left behind her family, her warm country, abundant fresh food and servants, for the life of an undergraduate on a small stipend, living in unheated digs, with food shortages, severe rationing, and some of the coldest winters England had ever experienced happened in those immediate post-war years. I was born there in Cambridge in 1947, and then Donald got his first job as a music and French teacher at Winchester College, which is where my sister Cara was born. But the lure of travel and warmer places was always in my father's mind. He was offered a position as Director of Music at Melbourne Grammar. In 1954, he went to Australia House in London to complete the application forms. It was the era of the £10 pom. On the form, it asked for wife's place of birth, so he naturally wrote Bombay. The clerk behind the counter looked a bit anxious, and he said, "Has she got any actual Indian blood?" Yes, said my father, her father is half Indian, so she'd be a quarter. And there was silence. We'll have to look into this, he was told. Dad had blundered into the White Australia policy. And people forget that one of the very first acts of the newly federated Australia in 1901 was the Immigration Restriction Act. Anyway, officialdom actually sent someone to Winchester to inspect my mother and us two girls, presumably to make sure, they thought, wasn't it nice that they took such personal interest in everyone who applied? But no, it was to make sure we weren't too dark, and they decided that Cara and I were acceptable, but they decreed that mother was more than 1/3 Indian. No one knew how they worked that out, but she could not be a £10 pom. They'd let her in, which was very kind, but she had to pay full fare. So it was a high price for a touch of duskiness for being a Chutney Mary. So to return now to the book title and its subtitles. So I've told you about Chutney Mary and the romance. Now it's time for Charming Irregularities. This was about our business. It was called Moti, and this is the Hindi word for pearl, my mother's name. It wasn't till later that we discovered if you pronounce it slightly differently, it means fat lady. Sue and I designed a range of clothes each year. We had patterns and samples made here. Each year in November, we found an empty shop, and for 2 or 3 weeks only, we had what is now known as a pop-up. We had a mailing list, which happily grew each year. That was the sort of invitation we sent. At first, we imported the fabric and had the clothes made in Melbourne. When that got too difficult, we moved to making up in India, where the woman who ran the workshop there became our very good friend, and that's where Darshan, our first driver, enjoyed his long sleeps. Our fabrics were all hand-woven, cotton mainly, lovely fabric to wear, and surprisingly durable, considering that every thread went in by hand. And having often been hand-spun before that, and the threads then hand-dyed, the fabric sometimes hand-block printed after weaving. So, not surprisingly, it's not like machine-made fabric. It's not consistent and predictable. Being a bit unpredictable or inconsistent is an intrinsic part of the pleasure of handmade goods. These are the swing tags we attach to each garment. Moti uses only natural fibres. Hand-woven fabrics are idiosyncratic. They may contain charming irregularities. It wasn't always quite so charming when meterage arrived with glaring inconsistencies of colour or thread tension. The odd chicken feather or grain of rice didn't bother us. That was evidence of the lives lived while it was being woven in small villages. But we knew that the Australian customs authorities would be less charmed by a grain of rice or a feather, and so we always had the fabric washed first. We had button front dresses arrive with no buttons. Although it was their error, they probably wondered what we were fussing about. Simple enough to get them sewn on here, they probably thought, but getting 8 buttons per garment, perhaps 100 dresses, sewn on here, cost more than making the whole dress. We once ordered 120 metres of a black silk cotton fabric. It arrived and it was grey. Not even dark grey, but mid-grey. When we protested by email, no answer for a while. And then, but madam, it's the Indian black. Nonsense, of course, but we had to learn to navigate the Indian dislike of saying no. Also that engaging sideways nod of the head, which could contain various meanings, ranging from an enthusiastic yes to a maybe or that should be okay. They're very fond of saying that should be okay. What does that mean, we used to think? Will it be okay or won't it be okay? An example this week, I just tried on a top that was made for me while we were in India just recently. I only got back about 10 days ago. And I asked the friend Sheila to make it. I assumed she had the pattern. Well, firstly, she hadn't noticed that I wanted the short version and not the long one. And it's actually been made as a mishmash of elements from numerous different tops we did over the years, none of them actually working. It's unwearable. And then I remembered she had mentioned, sort of en passant when we were there, that a flood had ruined many of the patterns. So why didn't she just tell me? It would have been so easy, but she was so eager to please, and they're so reluctant to say no. But it can be exasperating sometimes. Nevertheless, we did learn to be more patient, a bit more philosophical. Handmade goods are, in fact, humbling. They take time, often a lot of time. And we learnt there was no point being angry. We learnt that they would just sort of blank us, or there'd be silence. So there were certainly a lot of challenges, but they were completely outweighed by the charms of the people. The shared sense of humour is terribly important. Wondrous textiles, of course, and jewellery and embroidery, all of which we happily explored and indulged ourselves in. And although we sold Moti about 5 years ago, it's in very capable hands and going strong online and in Barwon Heads. We had dinner in Delhi a couple of weeks ago with the new owners, and I'm very happy to see Marilyn here, Christine here today. They're twins. We all get them confused. Here are some examples. These are examples of an embroidery stitch called kantha. It uses entirely and only simple running stitch. It's used on scarves and stoles that we commissioned over the years. And the red one, which I had on before, is in fact what I used as the template for the book cover. So if you look at the cover afterwards, it was photographed from one of those scarves. The book emerged as a combination of the pieces my mother wrote about episodes in her own life. And being episodic, they weren't enough for a whole book. So I intertwined her stories with, and leaving them completely in her vivid voice. And I interwove her stories with my own experiences in contemporary India. With my friend Sue, for more than 2 decades, every year in February, we packed our suitcases, first with a thick layer of cardboard patterns and samples of each garment, all of which we had worked on through the preceding year in Melbourne. And along with that were obviously our own clothes and shoes and gifts And then we each packed a copious pharmacopoeia to cover every possible adverse health event, and we often had to use them. And lastly, we packed the all-important casks of Australian red wine. Indian wine has improved a lot, actually, over the last decades, but it used to be pretty awful and awfully expensive. In fact, I've just got back from India, as I said. It was our first time back after that enforced 3-year COVID break. And there are a few things I can update you with. First of all, in a big city like Delhi, but I'm sure it's true in the other big urban centres, fewer women are wearing saris and salwar kameez. And so apart from the disappointment of seeing jeans and t-shirts instead of wonderful colours and fabrics, this has implications for the handmade fabrics I've been talking about. It leads to a decline in work for artisans and maybe the loss of something that's really very special. The growing middle class means more cars, more pollution, more obesity-related diseases. There's a growing wealth divide, and even more worrying, the disparity in IQs is increasing. There's a growing political divide. There's much more sectarian violence in the last few years and more religious division. And there's also a worrying threat to democracy with crackdowns on press freedom. The BBC recently produced a 1-hour documentary about Modi in Gujarat, and it's been banned in India. I mean, that never happens, usually. But I thought I should end on a positive note. The young man I told you about, who was our driver, Naresh, who left school at 15, who worked so hard to improve the health of girls and young women, he is now director of a much larger enterprise. The Ubuntu Foundation. It employs 150 previously unemployed people to drive tuk-tuks to collect rubbish every day from the slum area households. They're teaching people to use 2 small bins, which they supply, to separate wet and dry goods. These are collected because even if they had, bins there, people won't keep the rubbish in their house because there's a superstition that not only is it bad for your health, but it will affect your prosperity if you have rubbish in the house. So they would just chuck it out unless someone arrived to collect it. And I've seen in this exact place the enormous rubbish dump. I was there once where it was, like a small hill of rubbish just in the town. At that time, there was a cow right on top of the rubbish, munching, I don't know, looked quite happy. They've now cleared these dumps and planted shrubs instead. The rubbish is taken back to a large shed where large outdoor semi-covered concrete bins gradually break it down to compost. Everything's being tested properly. They did a complete survey of the area beforehand to get data on the health and composition of all the families. So they've got a benchmark position known. And the paper goods are compacted and sold. The plastic goods are compacted and sold. And sorting through all this rubbish, I said to him, but what about all the people who used to earn a living going through rubbish dumps? Horrible though it was their living. And he pointed to a conveyor belt in the shed where these people are now standing upright, not bent over double, standing upright, sorting the rubbish and getting a free meal and a cup of chai every now and then. They're leading dignified work lives. What a hero. I mean, he's proud of himself, as he should be, and he's won a community award. He knows it's a gradual education process for people, and we know here how hard it is to educate people about which to put in which bin. And these are people who have had no education and live absolutely on the edge of survival and death. He grew up in an urban slum himself, so he understands all that. His father won't speak to him. So first of all, he was dealing with a taboo topic like menstruation, and now his father thinks he's behaving like a rag picker himself, which is the bottom of the caste thing. So his father's not speaking to him, he's ashamed of him, but I'm hopeful. I had a feeling talking to them both that it might come round. I can show you some slides. So there's me and Sue and Naresh with some compacted garbage behind us. They send out tuk-tuks. This is, Naresh, this young boy standing there, the director's message, and it just sounds so... it's just admirable what he's been able to do. So there's how the rubbish was. And this is what they're doing. They're reaching out to 40,000 individuals. They've collected, 1,100,000 tonnes of waste already, reaching 6,000 households. So each day, they collect 4,000 kilograms. They process 1,200 kilograms of dry and 1,500 kilograms of wet. And there's the conveyor belt in the middle. And there's the compost at the end. Their biggest challenge, it seemed to us, was they're getting supported by SKF, which is a large international makes ball bearings and things, well-known international company, because they have to donate part of their proceeds to charities. And that funding runs out soon. So a lot of it comes from selling the compacted waste. But they need to sell the compost, and they haven't yet managed to work out how to do that and to whom. But, I feel confident they'll work that step out. This is the thing about awareness. As I say, it's hard enough here in Australia to understand which one goes into which colour. But imagine when you're trying to deal with a country where everything's a bit chaotic and the people are very uneducated and hovering between life and death often. So the number one really is the critical thing. And then they're doing everything they can to make it easy for people to segregate the waste. They're collecting it, they're monitoring, and then processing. They're just doing everything properly, and it's terribly impressive. So when people ask what was the highlight of my recent trip, it was this. It's truly inspirational. And if this is the day or the week of achievers, is that what you said? There we go. Thanks so much for coming.